In the year 800 AD, a caravan of merchants traveling along the high-altitude section of the Great Silk Road through the Tibetan Plateau disappeared without a trace. Of the 42 people, merchants, drivers, guards, only 7 reached the next trading post. The rest disappeared in the mountains, in the part of the route that locals called the Valley of Red Rocks. The survivors told of a creature that had pursued them for 4 days and 4 nights. A huge creature covered in reddish-brown fur, walking on 2 legs like a human, but not human. Chinese chronicles of the time mention this event in passing, referring to the attackers as wild mountain monkeys. Tibetan monks recorded a different version, about the Yeren, a forest man, a spirit of the mountains who killed those who disturbed his domain. The events of that year served as a warning to other caravans. Some merchants began to avoid high-altitude trails, choosing longer but safer routes through the deserts. Others hired more guards armed with spears and bows. But the Valley of Red Rocks remained part of the shortest route from Chang'an to the Western lands, and the merchants' greed often overcame their fear. What happened to Zhang Wei's caravan was recorded in several independent sources: Chinese trade records, Tibetan monastery chronicles, and Persian travel notes. The story has lost none of its horror even after 12 centuries. Zhang Wei's caravan left Chang'an, the capital of the Tang dynasty, at the beginning of the 5th month of the year 800. It was a large trade convoy, 42 people, 87 camels and mules, a cargo of silk, porcelain, tea, and iron goods with a total value of more than 10,000 silver liang. Zhang Wei was an experienced merchant who had made this journey 7 times in 20 years. He knew the dangers of the Silk Road: bandits, sandstorms, mountain passes over 15,000 feet high, where the air became thin and the cold penetrated even thick felt robes. The caravan included people of different nationalities and professions. Zhang Wei himself, 45 years old, a stout man with a bushy beard, wore an expensive silk robe and a fur hat. His younger companion, Liu Xiao, 32 years old, thin and nervous, kept records of transactions and watched over the cargo. 12 armed guards, most of whom were Turks or Uyghurs, carried composite bows, spears, and short swords. The rest were camel drivers, porters, cooks, and translators. The journey to the borders of Tibet took 2 months. The caravan traveled in the mornings and evenings, avoiding the midday heat of the Taklamakan Desert. They spent the nights in caravanserais or set up camp in the desert, posting guards. Zhang Wei was cautious. Bandits often attacked trade convoys in these areas, knowing that the caravans carried valuables. By the end of the 7th month, the caravan reached the foothills of Tibet. Here, the landscape changed. Instead of sand dunes, there were rocky plateaus, gorges, and steep paths winding along the mountain slopes. The air became colder and thinner. The camels moved more slowly, breathing heavily. People suffered from altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, weakness. In a small Tibetan village at the foot of the mountains, Zhang Wei hired a local guide, an old Tibetan named Dorje, who knew the trails through the highlands. Dorje was a short, wiry man of about 60, with a wrinkled face, weathered to a dark brown color. He wore a thick sheepskin coat, felt boots, and constantly twirled a prayer drum in his hands. When Zhang Wei showed him the route map, indicating his intention to pass through the Valley of Red Rocks, the shortest route to the next trading post, Dorje's face darkened. He was silent for a long time, turning the prayer drum, then said through an interpreter that the route was dangerous, not because of bandits or wild animals, because of those who live in the mountains, because of the Yeren. The interpreter, a young Uyghur named Mahmud, relayed Dorje's words. The Yeren is a wild man of the mountains, a creature over 7 feet tall, covered in thick red hair, with the strength of 10 men and enough intelligence to hunt not just like a beast, but like a predator who understands human weaknesses. The Tibetans had known about the Yeren since ancient times. They called them by different names: Migo, Kamo, Dromo. They considered them either evil spirits of the mountains or ancient creatures left over from the time before humans. Zhang Wei listened, nodded, but did not attach any importance to it. He was a practical merchant who believed in money, goods, and things that could be touched with his hands. Stories about mountain spirits seemed to him to be the superstitions of backward mountain dwellers. The route through the Valley of Red Rocks saved 10 days. 10 days meant less expense on food and less risk of encountering sandstorms or bandits on the alternative route. He insisted on this route. Dorje reluctantly agreed to lead the caravan, but set conditions. Travel only during the day. At night, set up camp in protected areas, build large fires and post guards. No hunting local animals, no desecrating sacred sites. Stone pyramids, prayer flags hung by Tibetans in the mountains. And most importantly, cross the valley as quickly as possible, without delay. On the first day of the 8th month, the caravan entered the Valley of Red Rocks. The name came from the color of the local rock formations. Red sandstone and iron-rich shale, which, at a certain angle of sunlight, created the illusion that the mountains were bleeding. The valley was a long, narrow gorge stretching for about 30 miles between two mountain ranges. Its width varied from a few hundred feet at its narrowest points to half a mile at its widest. A shallow, fast-flowing stream ran along the bottom of the gorge, its banks covered with low shrubs and sparse dwarf trees. The trail was difficult. Rocky and almost vertical in places, it wound along the slopes, crossed the stream at several points, and skirted huge boulders and scree. The camels moved slowly and cautiously. The drivers pulled them by the reins and cursed when the animals resisted. The air at this altitude, more than 12,000 feet above sea level, was cold even in the middle of the day, and at night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Nothing unusual happened on the first day. The caravan traveled about 8 miles and set up camp in the evening in a relatively wide part of the valley, where the rocks formed a natural semicircular niche that provided protection from the wind. Dorje insisted on 3 large fires instead of the usual one. The guards posted sentries around the perimeter of the camp, 2 at each of the 4 posts, changing every 3 hours. The night passed quietly. The usual sounds could be heard: the crackling of the fires, the snoring of sleeping people, and occasionally the quiet braying of mules or the snorting of camels. The sky was clear, the stars bright and numerous in the thin mountain air. The cold was severe. People slept wrapped in several layers of blankets and skins. On the second day, around noon, the caravan discovered the first sign. On the trail, in a section where it ran along a rocky cliff on one side and a steep slope on the other, lay a dead yak. The animal was large, fully grown, weighing at least 1,000 pounds. But it was not a natural death, or the result of an attack by a common predator. The yak's neck was broken. Its head was twisted at an unnatural angle, almost turned 180 degrees. The ribs on one side were broken inward, as if something had struck the animal with tremendous force. But the strangest thing was the position. The yak was lying on the edge of the trail, pressed against the rock, as if it had been thrown there with great force. The distance from the center of the trail to the rock was about 20 feet. Something had lifted the 1,000-pound animal and thrown it away like a child throws a rag doll. Dorje stopped the caravan. He approached the carcass and examined it closely. His face was impenetrable, but his hands gripped the prayer drum more tightly, spinning it faster. He walked around the yak, studying the ground around it. There were tracks in the dusty earth of the trail. Large, deep prints, similar to human feet but larger, about 14 to 15 inches long, 6 to 7 inches wide. 5 toes, distinct, with indentations from claws or nails. The width between the left and right footprints was about 4 feet. No human being takes such strides. The tracks led from the top of the slope, crossed the trail where the yak lay, then descended toward the stream, disappearing on the rocky bank. Dorje stood silently for a long time, looking at the tracks. Then he turned to Zhang Wei, to Mahmud the interpreter, to the chief guard, a tall Turk named Timur. He said they had to turn back immediately. The Yeren were close. They had killed the yak, possibly last night or this morning. It was a warning, or a show of force. The Yeren were clever. They did not attack immediately. First, they showed that this was their territory, that humans should leave. Mahmud translated. Zhang Wei frowned, looked at the tracks, at the dead yak. He asked if Dorje was sure it wasn't a bear. There were bears in these mountains, Tibetan blue bears, large and dangerous. Dorje shook his head. Bears leave different tracks, 4 paws, longer claws, a different gait. This wasn't a bear, it was a Yeren. It walked on 2 legs like a human, but it wasn't human. Its strength is such that it can break a yak's neck with 1 blow. Its intelligence is sufficient to hunt methodically and patiently. Zhang Wei hesitated. Turning back meant losing a week, returning to the beginning of the valley, choosing an alternative route that would add 10 to 12 days to the journey. It meant additional expenses and the risk of getting caught in the mountains in late autumn when the snow began to fall. On the other hand, there was a dead yak and the tracks of something very large and clearly dangerous. Lu Xiao, the younger companion, insisted on continuing. He said that the tracks could have been left several days ago, that the creature that left them was probably already far away. The yak could have been killed by bandits trying to intimidate the caravan, forcing them to abandon their goods and flee. Timur, the chief guard, was more cautious. He had hunted bears, wolves, and tigers in various lands. He had seen many predators. These tracks were unlike anything he had ever seen before. But he was a warrior who was paid to protect the caravan. If Zhang Wei decided to continue on his way, he and his men would fight anything, be it a beast or a spirit. Zhang Wei decided to continue, but with precautions. The caravan would move in a tight group, with guards around the perimeter, weapons at the ready. By evening, they would find a good place to camp, preferably near rocks, where there were fewer directions from which a threat could come. They would build large fires. They would double the guards. Dorje did not argue anymore. He just spun his prayer wheel and muttered prayers under his breath. His face took on the expression of a man who knew that trouble was inevitable but was unable to prevent it. The caravan moved on. They passed a dead yak. Some camels snorted and turned their heads away, sensing the smell of death. The drivers pulled them harder. The atmosphere in the caravan changed. People talked less. They looked back more often, peering into the slopes covered with sparse shrubs, into the rocky crevices, into the shadows under the overhanging cliffs. The rest of the day passed without incident. But several times the guards noticed movement on the slopes, something large, dark, moving quickly between the rocks. At such a distance, several hundred feet, it was impossible to make out any details. Maybe a mountain goat, maybe a shadow from a cloud, maybe something else. By evening, the caravan reached a spot that Dorje deemed suitable for camp. A rock wall about 50 feet high formed a natural barrier on one side. In front of the wall was a relatively flat area measuring about 100 by 150 feet. On the other 3 sides was open space with good visibility. A stream flowed 20 feet from the camp, providing access to water. They set up camp quickly and efficiently. The camels and mules were tied to stakes driven into the ground, placing the animals close to the rock wall. The tents were set up in a semicircle. 5 large fires were lit around the perimeter of the camp. Dinner was prepared. Rice porridge with dried meat, tea with salt and butter, according to Tibetan custom. Dorje insisted that no one stray more than 50 paces from the camp. Even for natural needs, they had to go in groups, not alone. The guards set up 8 posts instead of the usual 4, 2 in each direction. Each post was armed with bows and arrows, spears and torches. Night fell quickly. At this altitude, twilight did not last long. The sun set behind the mountains, and darkness covered the valley almost instantly. The stars were bright again, and the moon was in its 3rd quarter, giving off a little light. Around midnight, the sounds began. At first, it was barely audible, a low hum, like a very deep throat singing or vibration. It came from somewhere on the slopes surrounding the camp. The sound appeared, lasted a few seconds, and faded away. After a minute or two, it repeated, but from a different direction. People in the camp woke up. The guards on duty tensed up, peering into the darkness beyond the light of the campfires. The animals were restless. The camels made low rumbling sounds. The mules whinnied quietly and shifted from foot to foot. The sound continued for about an hour. It moved in a circle around the camp, as if something was circling their territory, studying and assessing it. Sometimes it seemed that there were several sounds, one from the north, another from the south, and a third from the west. It was as if there were not one creature, but several, coordinating their actions. Jiang Wei, Liu Xiao, and Timur stood by the central fire armed and tense. Dorje sat cross-legged, spinning a prayer wheel and muttering mantras. His face was calm, almost indifferent, the calmness of a man who has accepted the inevitable. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the sounds stopped. Silence fell. Absolute, eerie. Even the wind died down. Even the animals fell silent, frozen in stillness. Then, from the darkness beyond the northern perimeter of the camp, about 100 feet from the nearest fire, a cry rang out. It was neither human nor animal, but something in between. A high-pitched, piercing scream, like a shriek and a roar at the same time, lasting several seconds, echoing off the rocks. Everyone in the camp froze. The guards raised their bows and drew their strings. Timur shouted an order to light additional torches and bring them to the northern perimeter. Several men grabbed the torches and ran to the north side of the camp. The light from the torches illuminated the area beyond the campfires. Bushes, rocks, uneven ground. Nothing else. No movement, no figures. But then one of the guards, a young Uyghur named Ali, pointed to the ground about 50 feet from the camp. There, on the dusty soil illuminated by the torch, were fresh footprints. The same huge prints they had seen during the day near the dead yak, 14 to 15 inches, 5 toes, deep, clear. The tracks ran parallel to the northern edge of the camp from west to east, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. Timur ordered no one to leave the camp or pursue them. Whatever it was, it knew where they were. It was showing itself, but not attacking. It was waiting, choosing its moment. The rest of the night passed without sleep for most people. They sat by the fires, weapons in hand, peering into the darkness. Dorje continued to spin his prayer wheel and murmur mantras. Jiang Wei was silent, his face grim. At dawn, the sounds and presence disappeared. The morning was cold and clear. They examined the perimeter in daylight. The tracks were indeed where they had seen them at night. They also found another detail. On a large boulder 50 feet from the camp, at a height of about 6 feet, there was a scratch. 4 parallel deep grooves in the stone, each about a foot long. It was as if something with huge claws had scraped across the surface of the rock. Jiang Wei now understood that Dorje was right. These were not bandits. Not a bear. It was something else. Something he did not know or understand. But it was too late to turn back. They were in the middle of the valley, and it was faster to move forward than to retreat. He made the decision to move as fast as possible, to walk all day without long stops, to reach the end of the valley in 2 days instead of the planned 4, to leave part of the cargo behind if necessary to speed up the journey. The main thing was to get out of this place. The caravan set off at dawn. They moved quickly, almost running for humans, walking fast for camels. The drivers urged the animals on with sticks and shouts. The guards walked on the flanks, their heads constantly turning, scanning the slopes. Around noon, the first attack occurred. The caravan was passing through a narrow spot. The trail narrowed between a rock wall on the left and a steep cliff on the right, the passage no more than 12 feet wide. The camels walked in single file, the people in a tight group. From above, from a rocky ledge about 30 feet above the trail, a stone flew down. It was not a small cobblestone, but a massive boulder weighing at least 300 or 400 pounds. It crashed onto the trail, hitting the middle of the caravan, right between 2 camels. One camel was killed instantly. The rock crushed its back, and the animal collapsed without a sound. The second camel, standing nearby, was wounded by shrapnel. Blood flowed from several cuts on its side and leg. 2 drivers standing nearby were hit by flying pieces of rock. One suffered a deep cut on his arm, the other a bruised shoulder. The caravan stopped in chaos. People were screaming, camels were bellowing, breaking free from their reins. The guards raised their bows, aiming up at the ledge from which the rock had fallen. There, on the edge of the ledge, about 30 feet high, stood a figure. Huge, massive, covered with reddish-brown fur. Height, about 7 or 8 feet. Broad shoulders, long arms hanging below the knees. A large head sitting on a powerful neck with almost no visible transition. The face. It was difficult to make out the details at such a distance, but the shape was irregular. A protruding jaw, deep-set eyes, a broad nose. The creature stood motionless for a few seconds, staring at the caravan. Then it turned and disappeared over the edge of the ledge, moving with unexpected speed and agility for such a massive creature. Timur shouted at the guards to shoot. Several arrows flew upward, but the figure had already disappeared. The arrows struck the rocks and bounced off. Zhang Wei ordered them to move on immediately. Leave the dead camel behind and distribute its load among the other animals. Lead the wounded camel as long as it can walk. Bandage the wounded people on the go. The caravan set off, moving even faster, almost at a run. They passed through the narrow passage and emerged into a wider section of the valley. But the pursuit continued. For the rest of the day, the caravan saw figures on the slopes. Not one, but several. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3, moving parallel to the caravan, jumping from rock to rock with incredible agility. The distance was always several hundred feet, far enough that arrows could not reach them, but close enough that the people could see their pursuers and feel fear. Sometimes the figures let out the same cries, piercing, ear-splitting sounds that echoed in the narrow gorge. Sometimes they threw stones, but not at the caravan, only nearby. A demonstration of strength, intimidation. By evening, the caravan had traveled about 15 miles, almost twice the usual daily norm. The people were exhausted, the camels were breathing heavily. They needed to stop and rest. They chose a place to camp at the foot of an almost vertical cliff over 100 feet high. No one could climb down from the top. In front of the cliff was a narrow strip of relatively flat ground, about 50 feet wide. Beyond that was a stream and open space. They set up camp quickly. They lit 8 fires, forming an almost continuous wall of fire between the camp and the open area. The animals were tied as close to the cliff as possible. Guards were posted behind the line of fires, with orders to shoot at any movement. Dorje was gloomy. He said through Mahmoud that they had made a mistake by not turning back. Yerens hunt in packs, usually 3 or 4 individuals, sometimes more. They are smart. They do not rush into senseless attacks. They wait until their prey weakens, tires, makes a mistake. They wear them down psychologically, showing themselves, shouting, throwing stones, but not really attacking. Until night falls. Night is their time. Zhang Wei asked if there was a way to defend themselves. Dorje shook his head. The only option was to fight. Fire stops them. Yeren are afraid of fire and will not come close to the flames. But if the fire goes out, if the wood runs out, if people fall asleep, then the Yeren will come. The plan was simple. Keep the fires burning bright all night. They stocked up on as much wood as possible, sending a group of people to gather everything that burns within sight of the camp. The guards were divided into shifts, half awake, half resting, but on full alert. No one took off their weapons. No one left the camp. Night fell, and with it they came. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, when it was completely dark and the moon had not yet risen, the sounds began again. A low hum, a vibration surrounding the camp. Then screams, closer than last night, coming from several directions at once. Then figures appeared in the light of the campfires. First, one, huge, massive, standing at the edge of the lit area, about 50 feet from the nearest fire. Its fur was reddish-brown, thick, covering its entire body except for its face, palms, and soles. Its face. Its face was monstrous. Wide, flat, with a protruding lower jaw and large teeth visible even when its mouth was closed. Its eyes were small, deep-set, glowing with a yellowish sheen in the light of the fire. Its nose was wide, almost monkey-like. Its brow ridges were massive and prominent. The arms were long and muscular, with huge palms and thick fingers, at the ends of which gleamed dark claws several inches long. The legs were proportionally shorter than a human's, but thick and powerful. The creature stood looking at the camp. It did not move, only breathed, heavily, hoarsely, its chest rising and falling. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound, not a cry, but something else. Low, guttural, with intonations, almost like speech, but not in any known language. Then others appeared. 2 more figures on the left, 2 on the right, 5 in total. They surrounded the camp in a semicircle, standing on the border between light and darkness. Timur shouted an order. "Archers, draw your bows, take aim, but do not shoot without a command. Spearmen, move out behind the line of fires, form a barrier." 10 guards with spears stepped forward, standing between the fires and the creatures. Their spears were held out in front of them, their tips glinting in the light of the fire. Behind them were 8 archers, their arrows on their bows, drawn and ready to fire. They stood like this for several minutes. The humans and creatures stared at each other across 50 feet of space. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fires and the heavy breathing of both sides. Then one of the creatures, the largest one standing in the center, took a step forward. A slow, cautious step. It stopped. Another step, another stop. Timur shouted a warning. The creature did not react. Another step. Now the distance was about 40 feet. Timur gave the command. The archers fired. 8 arrows flew through the air, crossed the space, and struck the creature's massive body. Several arrows hit their mark. Timur saw the shafts enter its chest and shoulder. But the creature did not fall. It didn't even retreat. It just let out a low roar, grabbed one of the arrows sticking out of its chest, pulled it out, and threw it aside. The other 4 creatures growled in response. It was a low, guttural sound that vibrated in people's chests, causing their hearts to contract with primal fear. Then they moved forward, not running, but walking quickly, in sync, as if on command. Timur shouted for a second volley. The archers fired again. Several more arrows hit their mark. One of the smaller creatures on the right was wounded in the leg. An arrow had entered its thigh. It stumbled, slowed down, but did not fall. 30 feet. 25. The spearmen tensed, spears held forward. 20 feet. Now all the details were visible. Massive muscles moving under the fur, white teeth in bared mouths, yellowish eyes full of rage and hunger. Then one of the creatures, the one in front, with several arrows sticking out of its body, suddenly stopped. It looked at the bonfire, at the bright, high flames. It made a sound, not a roar, but something like a hiss or a snort. The others stopped too, 15 feet from the fires. They stood, shifting from foot to foot, swaying, looking at the fire and the people behind it. Dorja was right. The fire stopped them. Not completely. They came closer than most wild animals would dare. But it still stopped them. Several minutes of standoff. The creatures growled, bared their teeth, sometimes made feigned lunges forward, but did not cross the invisible line 15 feet from the fires. Then, as synchronously as they had approached, they retreated. First 20 feet, then 30, then they disappeared into the darkness. But they did not leave. Throughout the night, sounds could be heard around the camp. Growls, screams, the pounding of heavy feet. Sometimes moving shadows flashed in the light of the fires. Sometimes there was the sound of stones being thrown. The creatures were hurling rocks at the camp, but not with force, not aiming to kill, just to frighten and disturb. No one slept that night. People sat by the fires, weapons in hand, eyes red from lack of sleep and smoke. They constantly added wood to the fires, making sure the flames did not diminish. Jiang Wei now understood completely. These were not animals. Not in the usual sense. Animals do not plan, coordinate attacks, or wear down their prey psychologically. This was something else, something with intelligence, albeit primitive, animal intelligence, but sufficient for tactics and strategy. At dawn, the sounds stopped again. The creatures disappeared, dissolving into the mountains like spirits with the first rays of the sun. An inspection of the camp revealed the damage. Several camels had been wounded by stones, not fatally, but enough to make them limp. 2 mules had disappeared. They had broken their ropes in fear and fled into the darkness. Their bodies were found in the morning 200 feet from the camp. Their necks were broken, their bellies ripped open, their entrails partially eaten. The people were on edge. Some of the drivers demanded that they abandon the goods, the entire load, take only water and food, and run as fast as possible. Liu Xiao, usually calm, was pale, his hands trembling as he drank tea. Jiang Wei gathered everyone together. He said that there were about 15 miles left to the end of the valley. One day of fast walking. If they left now, without stopping, they would reach it by sunset. Beyond the end of the valley was a Tibetan trading post, people, safety. They just had to hold out for one day. One day. They decided to leave half of the cargo behind. They took the bundles off the weakest camels and stacked them by the rock. Silk, porcelain, tea, thousands of liang worth of goods abandoned in the mountains. But life is more important than goods. The caravan set off immediately after dawn. They moved very quickly, almost running. The camels, lightened by part of their load, walked faster. People urged them on with shouts and blows. The pursuit resumed almost immediately. Figures appeared on the slopes. Now there were more of them. Jiang Wei counted 7, maybe 8 different creatures moving parallel to the caravan. They became bolder. They came closer, sometimes descending onto the trail 100 feet in front of or behind the caravan, blocking the way for a few minutes, forcing people to stop, then retreating, allowing them to pass. A game. A hunt. They played with the caravan like a cat plays with a mouse before killing it. Around noon, the second direct attack occurred. The caravan was passing through a section where the trail ran along a stream, the terrain relatively flat without high rocks. Suddenly, a creature leaped out of the bushes on the left, 30 feet from the column. Not the largest, about 6.5 feet tall, but fast and agile. It did not rush at the people, but at the camels in the middle of the caravan. It ran up in 3 seconds, grabbed the reins of one camel, and pulled with such force that the animal, weighing about half a ton, fell on its side. The guards reacted quickly. The spearman closest to the attack thrust his spear into the creature's side. The tip went deep between the ribs. The creature roared, let go of the reins, and turned toward the man. With one blow of its massive paw, it knocked the spearman off his feet. The man flew several feet, hit a rock, and froze motionless. His neck was twisted at an awkward angle. Dead. The other 2 guards attacked, one with a spear, the other with a sword. The spear struck the creature's shoulder, the sword struck its arm. The creature grabbed the spear shaft, wrenched it from the man's hands, and threw it aside. The second guard was struck in the chest. The blow was so strong that the man doubled over, fell, coughing up blood. His ribs were broken, possibly his lung punctured. Timur and a group of 5 guards ran up. They surrounded the creature, attacking from different sides. Spears, swords, blows. The creature fought fiercely, but against 6 people, even with its strength and ferocity, it had little chance. One of the spears pierced its throat. Blood gushed out, dark, almost black. The creature let out a gurgling rattle, fell to its knees, then onto its side. It twitched for a few seconds, then froze. But victory came at a high price. One man was dead, another seriously wounded, possibly fatally. The camel that the creature had grabbed broke its leg in the fall. They had to finish it off and leave it behind. And the worst thing was that the other creatures on the slopes were watching. They saw that one of their own had been killed, and their reaction was not to flee or retreat. They screamed. The screams were louder, angrier, full of hatred and promises of revenge. Zhang Wei ordered them to move immediately. They took the bodies of the killed guard and the wounded man with them. You can't leave people behind. They left the creature's body behind. Several people lingered for a second, examining the dead Yeren in the daylight. Up close, it was even more monstrous. Its fur was thick, coarse, reddish-brown in color with grayish patches on its chest and belly. Its musculature was massive. Arms as thick as a human thigh, a barrel-shaped chest, legs like tree trunks. The palms were huge, the fingers thick, with hard calluses and dark, curved claws about 3 inches long. The face was terrifying in its near humanity. The skull is elongated, the forehead sloping, the brow ridges prominent. The eyes were small, deep-set, now glazed over in death. The nose was broad, the nostrils large. The mouth was wide, the lips thick, and when open, large yellowish teeth were visible. Incisors like a human's, but the canines were more developed and sharp. It's not a monkey, not exactly, but it's not a human either. Something in between. Something ancient, left over from before civilization. Mahmoud, the interpreter, whispered a prayer. Dorje spun his prayer wheel, his eyes closed. The caravan moved on. The wounded guard died an hour later. Internal bleeding, broken ribs piercing his lungs. The body was wrapped in cloth and tied to a camel. There was no time for a burial. They would bury him later if they made it to safety. The pursuit intensified. The creatures were everywhere. On the slopes, in the bushes, sometimes on the trail itself in the distance. They threw stones more often and aimed more accurately. Several people were injured, bruises, cuts. One driver was hit in the head with a stone, lost consciousness, came to after a few minutes, but was disoriented, stumbling as he walked, supported by 2 others. Towards evening, when the sun began to sink towards the horizon, the caravan saw the end of the valley ahead, about 3 miles away. The rocks parted, revealing a wider area. There, in the distance, were the roofs of buildings. A trading post. Hope flared in the hearts of the people. 3 more miles. An hour's brisk walk. Almost there. But the Yeren also saw the end of the valley, and they realized that their prey was escaping, that there was no more time for a long game. When the sun touched the peaks of the western mountains, beginning its rapid descent towards sunset, the attack began. First from the north, 3 creatures jumped out of the bushes and rushed towards the caravan. The guards met them with spears and arrows. One creature was wounded and retreated. The other 2 broke through the line, reached the camels, and began to attack. Chaos. The camels bellowed and broke free from their reins. People screamed and fought. Timur and a group of guards fought 2 creatures, thrusting spears and swinging swords. Then there was an attack from the south. 2 more creatures. Then from the west. The caravan was surrounded. Zhang Wei realized that this was the end. It was impossible to fight against such numbers, such strength. He shouted the order to drop everything and run to the station. Only people, no cargo, no animals. Run. Some of the people obeyed. They dropped the reins and ran along the path toward the exit from the valley. 30 to 35 people running, stumbling, falling, and getting up again. The guards and some of the drivers stayed behind, fighting to cover the retreat. Timur fought a huge creature, slashing with his sword and dodging the blows of its massive paws. Other guards formed a circle, spears out, protecting each other. Liu Xiao ran with the others. He looked back and saw one of the guards being grabbed by the creature, lifted above its head and thrown against a rock. The body hit with a terrible crunch and remained motionless. Dorje ran slowly. He was an old man, 60 years old, and years of living in the mountains had made him resilient but not fast. Mahmoud helped him, supporting him by the arm, One of the creatures spotted them. It gave chase. The distance was closing. 30 feet, 20, 10. Mahmoud stopped, turned around, and pulled out a short knife, the only weapon he had. He shouted at Dorje to keep running, not to stop. The creature reached Mahmoud. The young Uyghur stabbed it, plunging the blade into its stomach. It roared, grabbed Mahmoud's head with both hands and squeezed. The skull cracked with a wet sound. Mahmoud went limp. The creature threw the body away like a useless rag and turned to Dorje. But the old Tibetan was already far away, running as fast as his old legs would carry him, spinning his prayer wheel even as he ran, muttering mantras. Jiang Wei ran ahead of the group. Overweight and unaccustomed to physical exertion, he was gasping for breath, his heart pounding, his feet stumbling. But fear drove him forward. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of battle, the cries of people and the roar of creatures. Then the sounds began to fade. Not because the battle had ended in victory for the people, but because the people were dying out. 2 miles to the station. 1.5. 1. Twilight was falling fast. The sun had set behind the mountains, leaving only a reddish glow on the clouds. The group of refugees, now about 25 people, the rest having fallen behind, died, or been wounded and unable to continue running, reached the edge of the valley. The trail widened, leading out onto a plateau. In the distance, about half a mile away, the walls of the trading post were visible, smoke from fires, the lights of torches. Someone at the station noticed the fleeing people. Shouts rang out, and horsemen rode out of the gate. Tibetan guards on shaggy mountain horses, armed with bows and swords. The presence of horsemen, armed men, and open space forced the pursuers to stop. The Yeren remained at the edge of the valley, in the twilight, shadows among the rocks. They watched as their prey slipped away. They roared in impotent rage. The group of refugees reached the station. The gates opened, they were let in, and the gates slammed shut behind them. Safety. Finally. Jiang Wei collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. Around him were the remnants of his caravan. Of the 42 people, 23 had survived. Almost half were dead. Of the 87 camels and mules, not a single one remained. All the cargo was lost. Thousands of liang of silver, 20 years of trading reputation, all gone in the mountains. Liu Xiao sat nearby, his head in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. Dorje stood by the wall, spinning a prayer wheel, looking toward the valley, his face impassive. During the night, several wounded men who had fallen behind the group made it to the station. They crawled in, barely alive, wounded, in shock. They told fragments of what had happened after the main group fled. Temur fought to the end. He killed another Yeren and wounded 2 others. But there were too many of them. In the end, they surrounded him. His body was found the next day when a group of armed men cautiously returned to the site of the last battle. It was torn almost in half, its insides removed. The bodies of 7 other guards and drivers lay nearby. All dead. Some bodies were missing. 8 people were listed as missing, their bodies not found. Perhaps they had been carried off into the mountains. No one wanted to think about why. Of the 2 Yeren killed in the battle, 1 body remained. It was brought to the station and shown to monks from a nearby monastery who had arrived after hearing about the tragedy. The monks examined the creature. They confirmed that it was a Yeren, a wild man of the mountains. They knew of them from ancient records and rare sightings. Yeren usually avoid people and live in the most remote parts of the mountains. But sometimes, when people invade their territory, kill their prey, or insult their sacred places, the Yeren become aggressive. They hunt people, kill them, and take revenge. The monks performed rituals and prayers to appease the mountain spirits. They burned the Yeren's body along with offerings of food and incense. They asked the mountain spirits for forgiveness for the intrusion and for the bloodshed. Jiang Wei stayed at the station for 2 weeks, recovering physically and psychologically. Liu Xiao fell into a deep depression. did not speak for several days, just sat staring into space. Dorje returned to his village and continued to live his normal life. But his neighbors said that he became even more silent and spent even more time in prayer. The surviving members of the caravan went their separate ways. Some returned to Chang'an and told of the tragedy. But few believed them. Official reports spoke of an attack by bandits or wild animals. Stories about Yeren, creatures that looked like humans but were not human, were considered superstitions, exaggerations of traumatized minds. Jiang Wei returned to Chang'an a broken man. He lost all his capital and fell into debt to those who had financed the caravan. He spent the rest of his life in poverty, working as a lowly clerk. Before his death in 823, he dictated a detailed account of what happened in the Valley of Red Rocks to his grandson. The story was recorded, preserved in the family archives, and later fell into the hands of Chinese chroniclers. Tibetan monks also recorded the events in monastery records. Their version was more mystical, speaking of the wrath of mountain spirits and punishment for the arrogance of people who thought they could go anywhere without respect for the forces of nature. A Persian merchant who arrived at the station a month after the tragedy heard stories from survivors and locals. He recorded them in his travel diary, which was later translated into Arabic and became known in Western lands. All three sources, Chinese chronicles, Tibetan monastery records, and Persian travel notes, describe the same events with minor differences in detail, but agree on the main points. The caravan was attacked by creatures that resembled neither humans nor known animals. Creatures of enormous strength, with some degree of intelligence, living in remote mountains. After the year 800, merchants began to avoid the Valley of Red Rocks. The route through it was effectively closed for several decades. Longer but safer routes were used. Only towards the end of the 9th century, when the population of Yeren in that area may have decreased or moved away, did some daredevils begin to pass through the valley again. But always in large groups, well-armed, and only during daylight hours. Tibetan hunters and herders still tell stories about Yeren to this day. They claim that these creatures still live in the most remote parts of the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau, and the Kunlun Mountains. They rarely show themselves to people, but their traces are found. Huge footprints in the snow, broken trees, and dead animals with characteristic wounds. Modern science is skeptical about these stories. The lack of physical evidence, bodies, bones, skins, leads scientists to classify the Yeren as a cryptid, a creature from the realm of mythology and folklore rather than real zoology. But the people who live in the mountains know better. They have seen the tracks. They have heard the cries in the night. They have found torn yaks on the trails. They avoid certain valleys, certain areas of the mountains, especially at night. Because in the mountains, in those places where human feet rarely tread, creatures live. Ancient, powerful creatures that do not want to share their domain with intruders. And sometimes, when people forget about respect, about fear, about the fact that not everything in this world belongs to humanity, these creatures remind them. They remind us the way they reminded Jiang Wei's caravans in the year 800. With blood, death, and horror that the survivors carry in their hearts until the end of their days. The Valley of Red Rocks still exists today. Modern maps refer to it by a different name, but the local Tibetans know its old name. Sometimes tourists and adventure seekers try to pass through it. Most return without incident. But sometimes people disappear. Or they return with stories of strange sounds, movements on the slopes, a feeling of being watched, a primal fear that makes them run without looking back. And the old Tibetans shake their heads, spin their prayer wheels, and murmur mantras. They tell the young not to go there. Don't disturb those who were here before us and will be here after us. Don't think that the mountains belong to people, because the mountains remember. And those who live in the mountains remember too. They remember every invasion, every disrespect. And someday, if people go too far, forget their fear, forget the lessons of the past, the mountains will remind them again, just as mercilessly as they reminded Jiang Wei's caravans 12 centuries ago.